Sony just lent me a new ZV-E10 Mark II camera so that I can test and review it on my channel. And almost straight away, this camera has become my favorite of all time for budget sports videography. So if you're still looking for your first camera to film sports with, or you already have an older model, maybe even a Sony ZV-E10 Mark I, and you're looking for an upgrade, well, sit back, relax, and let me show you exactly why the new Sony ZV-E10 Mark II camera is the one for you. Alright, so I'm taking this show on the road today for a few reasons. Well, actually, let me start from the beginning. Yesterday, which was a Wednesday, my contact at Sony Canada reached out to let me know that she was willing to let me borrow this baby for a few days. This is the brand new ZV-E10 Mark II. She needs it on Monday to go make the runs of all the local stores to school them about all the new features, but she was happy to give it to me for the weekend. So I quickly scrambled and tried to find as many sporting events as I could get into on such short notice, and I did found one going on today. There's a football stadium somewhere over my right shoulder, and I'm going there after this. So basically, I just went pick up this camera and came straight here. I don't know much about this camera yet, haven't had any chance to play with it whatsoever. All I know is that this camera can shoot in 4K 60p in 10-bit, which is very exciting because the previous version, the Mark I, could only do 4K in 24 frames or 30 in 8-bit. So this is a huge improvement. So I'm really looking forward to testing that tonight at this football game. The other thing is, like I said, I left in a hurry and I knew I would forget something. And of course I did. I forgot my field monitor. Typically I film with a big 7-inch field monitor on top of my camera. This time all I can rely on is this little LCD screen right here. It's one of those things that when you're used to something much bigger, it's going to be a challenge to follow, especially a football with these big Hail Mary passes and stuff. It'll be interesting to see if I can keep up. But I don't mind a challenge, so we'll see what happens. So far, all I can say about this camera, I kind of like the body. I don't even mind the white color. It's different. Obviously, it comes in black as well. But if I was to buy the camera, especially if you're thinking of like reselling it later on once you upgrade to something else, I'm kind of afraid that the white color would get dirty over time, and then ultimately when you're trying to sell your camera, it would look probably older than it actually is. So personally, I would stick with black. The other thing is the grip is bigger. So for someone like me who has relatively big hands, this is actually quite good. But I mainly like the reason why this grip is bigger, and that's because there's a new battery. Well, it's not a new battery, but it's basically the same battery that's in the FX30, the FX3. It's the NP-FC100. This battery is bigger and lasts much longer than the one that was in the previous version of this camera. I highly doubt that you would need more than 2 of those to film an entire game, plus pre-game, plus post-game and everything. So I'm gonna go in there, get my credentials, get set up, get familiar with the camera, and yeah, hopefully it all goes well. The other thing I forgot to mention is that I also managed to get credentials for a basketball game the very next day. So it will be interesting to see the difference in quality between outdoor footage and indoor footage. But yeah, for now, let's just focus on football. So as you can see, the image quality produced by this camera is very impressive. It is on par with my Sony FX30, which makes total sense since both cameras have the exact same sensor. But to achieve this level of quality, you have to maximize the camera by using the right settings. For example, I made sure to use the highest bitrate and color depth, but most importantly, I used the cleanest ISO values only. For almost the first half of the game, I was shooting at 800, which is the base ISO value in S-Log 3 on both this camera and the FX30. But when the sun went down, I shot the rest of the game at 2500 ISO, which is the second base ISO on the FX30, but on this camera, it does reset the noise and give you a clean image again, just like on the FX30, but Sony doesn't officially call it a second base ISO because the dynamic range at 2500 is not quite as good as it is at 800. But let's be honest, we all love a second base ISO for the noise reset and not necessarily for the optimal dynamic range. So I'm quite happy to shoot at 2500 ISO in poor lighting conditions with the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. So now let's move on to the basketball game I shot the very next day. The main thing I was curious to test that day was the image stabilization, because the previous night I didn't use it at all. Instead, I used the image stabilization in my Sony 70-200 G Master lens. I did that because I figured that the image quality would be at its best with the active stabilization of the camera turned off, since there is a small crop when this setting is turned on. But tonight, since I'm filming with my Tamron 35-150, which does not have image stabilization, I am curious to try the active stabilization of the camera and see what all the fuss is about. Because on the ZV-E10 Mark I, the active stabilization was and still is pretty garbage. But apparently on the Mark II, it is way better. So I'm curious to see if this is good enough for sports like basketball where there are lots of camera movements. As you can see, the image quality is still quite impressive indoors. Even in a super dark situation like the play introductions, for example, shooting at 2500 ISO with the ZV-E10 Mark II was giving me a super clean image. But keep in mind that I was shooting in S-Log3 and that these clean ISO values do change when you use a different picture profile. Otherwise, regarding the active stabilization, it is definitely way better than on the Mark I. I was quite happy with the results, and in real time, everything looked perfect. But when I slow down my 60p footage to 40% speed, you can see some jittery movements around the ball, which are caused by the active stabilization fighting with my camera movements. Almost as if the two were literally playing a game of tug of war against each other. This is not something you would see if the camera had IBIS, which is mechanical stabilization applied to the sensor. Instead, what you are looking at is active stabilization, which is done electronically. But as far as active stabilization goes, this is actually a very good result. Alright, so just to give you a bit of context, I filmed those two games a few days ago, and now that I think I know the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II pretty well, I'm ready to give you my final thoughts on it. Like I mentioned in the intro of this video, this camera has officially become my favorite camera and my #1 recommendation for budget sports videography. If you think about it, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is basically an FX30 that's $800 cheaper but can potentially overheat. And more on the overheating aspect later, but first I want to clarify what my definition of a budget mirrorless camera actually is. And that's pretty simple. It's any mirrorless camera that costs less than $1,000. And the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II, coming in hot at $998, in my opinion, is way better than any camera in that price range. First of all, it has a great sensor, the same one as the FX30 and the A6700, which are both more expensive cameras. And it also has all the bells and whistles like 4K 60p in 10-bit color, real-time recognition autofocus, focus breathing compensation, S-Cinetone, improved stabilization, the ability to import user LUTs, improved battery life, improved rolling shutter, improved LCD screen, and improved touch menu and display. All of that, in my opinion, makes the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II the Rolls-Royce of budget mirrorless cameras. So much so that I think even the current ZV-E10 Mark I users would benefit greatly from buying this camera, especially if you're at a point where you want to start producing sports videos in 4K. This is, again, according to my standards, the only budget camera that doesn't pretty much force you to shoot sports in 1080p because of frame rate limitations in 4K. Unfortunately, it doesn't shoot in 4K 120 like the FX30, but 4K 120 on the FX30 does come at a price. There's a massive crop and a big loss of image quality. So personally, I'd rather have a camera that only does things it's actually good at. And like I said, 4K 60, especially in 10-bit 422, is already way better than any other budget camera on the market. Now, let's talk about the reasons why the ZV-E10 Mark II is so much cheaper than the FX30 before we finally get to the overheating conversation. Here's a list of features that are not on the ZV-E10 Mark II, but that you can find on the FX30. First off, we got 4K 120 recording, then we got IBIS, internal fan, weather sealing, optional XLR handle, full-size HDMI, 2 card slots, and real/official dual native ISO. So basically, if you're on the market for a new camera and you're hesitating between those two, it's up to you to decide if these features are worth an extra $800. I'm guessing the deciding factor for most of you will either be 4K 120, image stabilization, or overheating. Well, since we already talked about the first two, let's finally discuss the overheating potential of the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. I'm happy to report that on a cool Montreal night of 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius, I was able to film football for well over 4 hours if you count all the pre-game and post-game activities, and the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II did not overheat at all. I didn't even get a warning. And at the basketball game, I knew there was no chance of the same thing happening in a fully packed arena, especially that the temperature that day was a bit higher at 79 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. So I did what I always recommend doing when filming on a hot day or in a fully packed gym. I used my Ulenzi external cooling fan, and again, 0 overheating warnings throughout the game. So I'm obviously not a scientist, so take my word and my experience for what it's worth, but I believe that if you do own a good external cooling fan like this one, overheating should not be a concern at all with the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. And if you don't have one, I've put a link in the description to help you get one ASAP because they are really a must for budget sports videography. And of course, there's a link to the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II in the description as well if you're interested in buying one or simply learn more about all the details I did not mention in this video because they were simply not related to sports videography. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review, and if you did, make sure you subscribe to my channel because there will be plenty more coming in the near future.